Hey, welcome back to our program. This is the weekend of the commemoration of 9/11. 9 years ago this week, the tragic instance of those planes flying into the World Trade Center. And a lots of interesting time because each year we have commemorated this terrible event through services and remembering back, where this year we have all the political mix in the gumbo of controversy over the mosque and the burning of the Quran down in Florida, but it doesn't take away from the terrible event that happened and the poignant stories that so many people have. And I just want to remember back a minute and tell you some of the things that I remember. Do you remember where you were on 9/11? I mean, there's 4 or 5 events in my life where I specifically knew where I was. Obviously when I got married, when my kids were born, but particularly when John Kennedy was killed. I remember very well exactly where I was at Tulane Law School down in New Orleans. And I certainly remember the Cuban Missile Crisis event. I happened to be over at Cambridge University, where it was very controversial of what Kennedy did back in the 1960s. And then, of course, the 9/11 event. I don't know where you were. I was at home just getting my day underway I think about 8 o'clock in the morning, and a girl who'd worked for me for a number of years in the Department of Insurance called to say, turn on your television, a plane's hit the World Trade Center. And I turned on my television set, and at the time it seemed like it was an aberration. It might have been a smaller plane that had gotten off course. No one thought that there would be all of the terrible controversy involving these terrorists, and then the story unfolded and just became so tragic. And once I saw the implications, I heard the president, I got the reports of the second tower being hit and the plane that was attacking the Pentagon. Obviously, we turned personally to what affects our lives, and what affected my lives were where my children were. I called all of my kids. I called my 2 younger daughters and my son, who I got on the phone. My son was just walking in school, in high school at the time, said, tell your class to turn on television. This is an unbelievable event that's taking place. You should watch this. Got to all 3 of my kids. My oldest child, Campbell, was with NBC News at the time. I talked to her the night before, and she had told me that she was on her way to California, the last ride on Air Force One. Nancy Reagan was taking that flight. They were retiring Air Force One. It was an older model that I think was built for Dwight Eisenhower when he was president. She was the only reporter on Air Force One making the flight from Washington back to California, where it was going to be mothballed and made a museum. Nancy Reagan was on that flight. It was quite an event for her to be on that flight. Then she was coming back in the very early hours, I think flying all night to get back into Washington, D.C., because she was the White House correspondent. Well, I called her cell phone, no answer. Obviously, I was concerned because there was a worry that a plane was going to hit the White House or maybe the Capitol. And so I couldn't get that number, couldn't get her at home. And you know what I tried to do? I called the White House switchboard. They're supposed to be the most efficient switchboard in the world. And when I got, what I heard was a recording and said, hang on for a minute, and then it clicked. The whole thing went dead. Well, that really got me very, very worried. I didn't know what the heck was happening with my oldest daughter. And then about 20 minutes later, Matt Lauer, I was watching NBC, came on and said, now let's go to a live report across the street from the White House from NBC's Campbell Brown. So I knew she was okay. Later she told me when they gave the word to evacuate, she saw Vice President Cheney being almost dragged by the Secret Service down into a very special protection tunnel. She grabbed her shoes, she said she was barefoot, ran out the door as fast as she could, went across the street to, I believe, the Willard Hotel, right across the street from the White House, and started broadcasting live. Stayed there for like 3 days. We had to bring her in clothes and food. She never left doing the broadcasting of the event of 9/11. So my family was safe, and then I tried to call my good friend Kevin Salter. He's a lawyer up in New York City. Couldn't get him on the phone, his family. Kevin worked directly across the World Trade Center. As I later learned in a very poignant conversation, when the first plane hit, he got out of the building, they evacuated his building, and then it became a huge fog of soot. He could not even see his hands in front of him. He crawled for about 3 blocks up away from the World Trade Center, told me that somebody opened a door. He saw a door slightly open on the sidewalk and opened the door and jumped into a bank building and rode out the dust cycle there, then wandered some 40 blocks uptown to finally get home sometime late that night. He was interviewed, by the way, on a number of national television shows. And then the final remembrance I have is my friend Neil Levin. Neil was in charge of the World Trade Center. It was owned by the Port Authorities of New York and New Jersey, and he was the director of the ports, and he was on the 42nd floor when the plane hit. He had asked me to come up and have lunch with him in the World Trade Center at the breakfast location on the 42nd floor. I plan to do so a week or two later. And Neil was a good friend. We'd worked very closely on a whole cross-section of insurance issues when he was the insurance commissioner of New York. We'd traveled to England together. We'd had meetings on a number of occasions, got to know he and his wife, and it was a very, very terrible tragedy because once we saw the implications where the plane hit, we knew that Neil certainly was lost, and he was. They never found his body. It just evaporated when the plane hit. So those are some of my remembrances about the terrible tragedy of 9/11. I'm sure you have your particular remembrances, and I just pass that on to you in terms of what I thought was important to me. There'll be a number of poignant stories over this weekend as this terrible event will be commemorated year after year, hopefully something we'll never see in this country again. I'll be right back.